My neighbor built his fence 3 feet into my property and told me to deal with it or move. He thought owning the bigger house made him untouchable. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly preparing something that would change everything he believed about his perfect little kingdom. My name is David Rodriguez, and at 47 years old, I thought I'd seen every type of entitled neighbor imaginable. As a civil engineer with 20 years of experience in land development, I dealt with property disputes, zoning issues, and construction conflicts throughout my career. But nothing prepared me for William Hartwell, the man who moved in next door and decided my property rights were negotiable. I'd been living peacefully in my modest 2-story home in Denver for 8 years when Bill bought the vacant lot next to me. The property had been empty since I moved in, just 2 acres of undeveloped land that I'd grown accustomed to having as a buffer. Bill Hartwell was everything I wasn't: flashy, loud, and completely convinced that money could solve any problem. At 52, he'd made his fortune as a real estate developer, and he wanted everyone to know it. From our first conversation, Bill made it clear he saw me as an inconvenience. "You know, David," he said during one of our early encounters, "if you ever want to sell and upgrade to something more suitable, I might be interested in expanding my property." The arrogance in his voice should have been my first warning, but I just smiled politely and told him I wasn't interested in selling. That's when I saw something shift in his expression. A flash of irritation that told me Bill Hartwell wasn't used to hearing the word no. Construction on his mansion began 6 months later, and it was immediately clear that Bill intended to build something spectacular. 4 stories, wraparound balconies, a 3-car garage, and elaborate landscaping that would transform the entire lot into what he called his personal estate. What bothered me was Bill's attitude toward property lines and regulations. But I started watching more carefully, and what I observed made me begin some research of my own. Bill seemed to have a casual relationship with permits and proper procedures. Workers would show up on weekends when city inspectors weren't around. And most concerning to me as a civil engineer, I noticed they were doing significant excavation without the environmental assessments that should have been required. So I began quietly gathering information, not because I was looking for trouble, but because something about Bill's project didn't feel right, and my professional experience had taught me to trust those instincts. The first major confrontation came 18 months later, when Bill's landscaping crew began installing a privacy fence along our shared property line. I watched from my kitchen window as workers started setting posts and immediately realized they weren't following the actual boundary markers. I walked outside with my property survey and approached the crew foreman. "Excuse me, but I think you're putting that fence on my property," I said, pointing to the survey stakes that clearly marked the boundary. The foreman looked uncomfortable but said he was just following the plans he'd been given. That's when Bill emerged from his house wearing an expensive suit and the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. That's when Bill's mask slipped completely. "David, here's the thing. I own a $4 million home. You own a little house that maybe breaks 6 figures. When there's a dispute between us, who do you think the city is going to believe?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "So here's my advice. Deal with it or move. Maybe it's time you found a neighborhood more suited to your economic situation." I felt my face flush with anger, but I kept my voice level. "Bill, this isn't about economics. It's about property rights and legal boundaries." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Good luck proving it, buddy. That's what you get for living next to success." I walked back to my house with Bill's words ringing in my ears, but what he didn't know was that his arrogant dismissal had just confirmed something I'd been suspecting for months. Because the truth was, I hadn't just been casually observing Bill's construction project. As a civil engineer, I'd noticed several red flags that suggested he wasn't following proper development procedures. So I'd started doing what I do best: methodical, thorough research into every aspect of his project. It began with a simple records request at the county planning office. I wanted to see Bill's building permits, his environmental impact assessments, and his compliance documentation. What I found was immediately concerning. Bill's permits were technically valid, but they were based on property classifications that didn't match what I was seeing on the ground. The land was listed as suitable for residential development with no environmental restrictions, but my engineering experience told me that classification was wrong. So I started digging deeper into the property's history, its geological surveys, and most importantly, its environmental status. That's when I discovered something that Bill either didn't know or was hoping no one would notice. According to federal environmental databases, a significant portion of Bill's property, including the area where his mansion now stood, was classified as protected wetland. Wetlands are federally protected under the Clean Water Act. You can't build on them without extensive permits from the Environmental Protection Agency, permits that require years of review and almost never get approved for private residential development. The penalties for unauthorized wetland development are severe: massive fines, criminal charges, and mandatory restoration. But I needed to be absolutely certain before I acted on this information. So I requested detailed environmental surveys from the EPA, cross-referenced them with historical floodplain maps, and even conducted some discrete soil tests along our shared property line. What I discovered gave me exactly what I needed to deal with Bill's fence problem permanently. Not only was Bill's entire mansion built on protected wetland, but his construction had violated at least a dozen federal environmental regulations. He'd filled in natural water channels, destroyed habitat for protected species, and altered drainage patterns that affected the entire area's ecosystem. But there was more. The environmental damage extended beyond just his construction. Bill's landscaping project had involved bringing in thousands of tons of fill dirt to raise the elevation of his lot, fundamentally altering the natural water flow. Most damning of all, I discovered that Bill's surveyor had used fraudulent boundary markers to hide the fact that his construction extended not just into my property, but into a federally protected wetland buffer zone. I now had documentation proving that Bill's entire dream estate was an environmental disaster that violated multiple federal laws, but I decided not to act immediately. Instead, I wanted to give Bill one more chance to do the right thing about the fence. I knocked on his door the following weekend with a simple request. "Bill, I've done some research on our property dispute. I think there might be some confusion about the boundaries. Would you be willing to bring in an independent surveyor to settle this?" Bill opened the door wearing golf clothes and an expression of barely concealed irritation. "David, I thought we settled this. The fence stays where it is. I understand you believe that, but I've found some discrepancies in the property records that I think you should know about." Bill's eyes narrowed. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Well, it appears there might be some environmental considerations that affect both our properties. I think it would be in everyone's best interest to get a proper survey done." That's when Bill made the mistake that sealed his fate. Instead of showing any curiosity about potential environmental issues, he stepped closer and lowered his voice to a threatening whisper. "David, let me make something very clear. I don't care what you think you found in some dusty county records. I own this land. I built this house. And that fence isn't moving. If you have a problem with that, take me to court." He paused, looking me up and down with obvious disdain. "And just so we're clear, if you keep harassing me about this, I might decide that your little house is affecting my property values. There are all kinds of code violations I could report." I nodded slowly, absorbing both his words and his clear threat. "I understand your position, Bill. I hope you understand mine when I do what I have to do." He smirked. "Do your worst, buddy. That's what you get for living next to success." I walked home and immediately called the EPA's Environmental Enforcement Hotline. "I'd like to report unauthorized construction on protected wetland," I told the agent who answered. I have documentation of multiple violations of the Clean Water Act, including habitat destruction and illegal filling of federally protected areas. Agent Patricia Hayes took my report and scheduled an inspection for the following week. I also sent her digital copies of all my research, the environmental surveys, the construction photos I'd been taking, the permit discrepancies, and the soil sample results. The EPA inspection team arrived on a Tuesday morning in unmarked vehicles. Bill wasn't home. He'd left early for what looked like a golf outing. I watched from my kitchen window as 3 agents spent 4 hours documenting everything on Bill's property. They took soil samples, photographed the construction, measured the filled areas, and used ground-penetrating radar to map the original wetland boundaries. Agent Hayes knocked on my door around noon to thank me for the report. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is exactly what your documentation suggested. We're looking at massive wetland violations, unauthorized habitat destruction, and illegal alteration of protected water systems. The penalties for this level of violation can exceed $2 million plus mandatory restoration." "What about the fence that's on my property?" I asked. Agent Hayes smiled grimly. "That's the least of Mr. Hartwell's problems right now." Bill returned home around 4 p.m. to find EPA violation notices posted on his front door, his mansion, and his precious fence. The notices informed him that all construction activity was immediately prohibited, pending a full environmental enforcement action. I was working in my garden when Bill stormed across the property line. Ironically, the same property line he'd been violating with his fence. "David, what the hell did you do?" I looked up from my tomato plants with mild surprise. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" "Don't play dumb with me. The EPA was here all day. They're saying my house is built on some kind of protected land. This is because of our fence dispute, isn't it?" I set down my gardening tools and faced him directly. "Bill, 3 weeks ago I offered to have an independent surveyor look at our boundary dispute. You threatened me instead. I told you I'd do what I had to do. You can't destroy someone's home over 3 feet of property line." "I didn't destroy anything, Bill. I reported environmental violations that I discovered during my research. The fact that those violations are so extensive isn't my fault." Bill's face was red with rage and what I suspected was dawning panic. "This is harassment! I'll sue you!" "Bill, you threatened to report me for code violations to force me to accept your illegal fence. You told me that my house was too small to matter in a dispute with your mansion." I gestured toward his house, now decorated with EPA violation notices. "That's what you get for building your success on protected wetland." The full scope of Bill's problem became clear over the following weeks. The EPA's enforcement action was swift and brutal. His entire property was classified as an active environmental restoration site. His mansion, garage, pool, and landscaping were all scheduled for demolition. The financial penalties were staggering: $2.3 million in fines for wetland destruction, plus the estimated $800,000 cost of environmental restoration. Bill's real estate license was suspended pending investigation into whether he'd knowingly violated environmental laws on other projects. The fence dispute resolved itself exactly as Agent Hayes had predicted. Bill's lawyer contacted me within a month to offer a settlement. He'd remove the fence and pay for a new survey to clearly mark our property boundaries. 6 months after the EPA inspection, I watched demolition crews tear down Bill's mansion. The land is being restored to its original wetland state as part of a federal conservation program. It'll never be developed again, which means I'll have a beautiful natural buffer area next to my property permanently. Bill moved into a rental apartment across town. His development company went bankrupt and he's facing potential criminal charges related to environmental fraud on several other projects. I received one piece of correspondence from Bill after his house was demolished. A brief letter that simply said, You destroyed my life over 3 feet of fence." I never responded. There was nothing to say. Bill Hartwell had built his perfect kingdom on illegally stolen land. then tried to steal more land from his neighbor when he thought his wealth made him untouchable. What he didn't know was that some of us prepare for exactly those kinds of bullies. Sometimes the quiet neighbor with the small house isn't someone you can push around. Sometimes they're a civil engineer who knows how to research property records and recognizes wetland violations when they see them. And sometimes when you build your kingdom on protected land and then threaten your neighbors, that kingdom comes crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. "David, good morning," he said, walking over with confidence. "I see you're concerned about our fence project." "Bill, your fence is 3 feet into my property. Look at the survey markers." Bill glanced at the stakes dismissively. "Oh, those old things? Property lines in this area are pretty fluid, David. I had my own surveyor come out, and this is where the fence belongs." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. "Bill, you can't just decide where property lines are. I have the official county survey right here.